Hi, I'm Jim. Thanks for tuning in to the Great Books, Big Ideas channel. In this show, we continue our series on The Great Conversation by Robert Maynard Hutchins. We're up to chapter 4, The Disappearance of Liberal Education. Now, to this point, Hutchins has been cheerleading for the virtues of liberal education, organized around dialectical discussions about great books from the Western tradition. He's been a critic of vocational training educators who are inspired by John Dewey's theories, and he's made a case that a great book's liberal education for everybody is economically feasible and is actually compatible with the needs of modern society. Now, in chapter 4, he begins with the fact that compulsory public education has effectively been achieved in the West, but this does not mean that such education is good enough. It doesn't come close to hitting the aims of a true liberal education. Not that that matters to most people. And he says, I'm quoting him here, what goes on in school is regarded as of relatively minor importance. The object appears to be to keep the child off the labor market and to detain him in comparatively sanitary surroundings until we are ready to have him go to work. The kind of universal education we have can only be rationalized on such a basis, keeping kids off the streets, babysitting them until they're ready to work. That's kind of a cynical way to think of it, isn't it? Or it could be rationalized on the basis of bringing students together for social or recreational purposes. And at a basic level, he says, the American educational system sort of achieves those ends. And I'm going to quote him now. It throws young people together, since this does not take any greater effort than is required to pass compulsory school laws and build buildings. The accomplishment of this purpose would not at first blush seem to be a matter for boasting. I'm going to continue on because I like the writing in this paragraph. Yet we often hear of it as something we should be proud of, and even as something that should suggest to us the main line of a sound educational policy. We often hear that bringing young people together, having them work and play together, and having them organize themselves democratically are the great contributions to democracy that the educational system can make. This is an expansion of the doctrine that was popular in my youth about the moral benefits conferred on everybody through intercollegiate athletics, which was in turn an adaptation of the remark dubiously imputed to the Duke of Wellington about the relationship between the Battle of Waterloo and the playing fields of Eton. This makes me chuckle because Hutchins, when he was the president of the University of Chicago, he got rid of the football team. So anyway, now while we cannot deny that socialization and recreation present some real benefits to students, he says, quote, it seems on the face of it a trifle absurd, however, to go to the trouble of training and engaging teachers, of creating laboratories and libraries, and of laying out a program of instruction and learning if, in effect, the curriculum is extra and the extracurriculum is the heart of the matter. I love the chiasmus turn of phrase there at the end. You know, we make the extracurricular activities, the socialization, the recreation, the most important purpose of that compulsory education. And the curriculum itself is like a byproduct. Shouldn't the educational system have something more to do with training the mind? To that end, a liberal education would best lay the rational foundations for good physical, moral, and social behavior. But the fact is, liberal education in America has disappeared. Why? And that's what he looks at in this chapter. There's two reasons, he says. First, internal decay, and second, external confusion. Let's talk about internal decay first. The teachers themselves destroyed the great books. Classical scholars, this is who he has in mind, and we're going back here to like the 19th century, early 20th century. Classical scholars who should have been stewards of that tradition were more interested in philological details and pedantic drills. They, quote, murdered to dissect, as Wordsworth put it, and they rendered the great books dull and meaningless to generations of students. It's like an own goal. As for the external confusion, Hutchins thinks that the humanities and social sciences became confused about the nature and scope of the scientific method, and they lost their way. They misapplied the methods of experimental science to their fields, and they devalued other methods, which had the effect of making older pre-scientific thinkers seem outdated and outmoded. They were labeled unscientific and thus became worthless. In the meantime, universal compulsory education was achieved in the United States, and this expansion of educational reach and scope was made possible by the, quote, triumphs of industrialization, which stemmed from the, quote, triumph of technology, which stemmed from the, quote, triumph of science, which is promoted by a culture of specialization. Great books and the liberal arts were identified in the public mind with dead languages, arid routines, and an archaic pre-scientific past. And so scientific thinking and specialization and vocational training, hearkening back to a previous chapter, they stepped in to replace liberal arts education, and liberal arts education vanished from the landscape. Does that sound familiar? Hutchins believes that the public confused names with things. The dissectors and drill masters might have been teaching in the name of liberal education, but they really weren't doing liberal education. They lost the spirit of liberal education. And the modern liberal arts college that has replaced those crusty old philologists has very little to do with the true liberal arts. Hutchins does not think that science, technology, and industrialization and specialization has made the great conversation irrelevant at all. It's needed more than ever before. And then he finishes the chapter by turning to the theme of community. The creation of community he sees as a task for the future. But if we are to foster community, we cannot merely throw technology into the mix. Let me quote this paragraph on page 30 of the essay. Community seems to depend on communication. This requirement is not met by improvements in transportation or in mail, telegraph, telephone, or radio services. These technological advances are frightening rather than reassuring, and disruptive rather than unifying in such a world as we have today. They are the means of bringing an enemy's bombs or propaganda into our homes. I can't help but think of the internet, which post-dates this essay, but I have a feeling he would see that technology as just as disruptive, if not more so, and just as frightening. Come up with your own examples. So we must have something intelligible and human to communicate, which is why we need the great conversation, especially because we have all become specialists in society. We need to find common ground. And the great conversation carves out a space for such a community to grow. And then he ends the chapter with a vision. And I'll quote that for you here. Imagine the younger generation studying great books and learning the liberal arts. Imagine an adult population continuing to turn to the same sources of strength, inspiration, and communication. We could talk to one another then. We should be even better specialists than we are today because we could understand the history of our specialty and its relation to all the others. We would be better citizens and better men. We might turn out to be the nucleus of the world community. That's chapter 4. I'm really curious to read your comments about this chapter because I see tons of parallels to our contemporary educational and cultural environment. I see liberal arts disciplines mired in confusion, flailing around in the throes of excessive theorizing. Don't get me started. I see a society that's gone all in on STEM education, genuflecting at the altar of science and technology. But I also see a lot of us here on BookTube finding ways to keep the great conversation going in spite of all that. It's remarkable how an essay that's over 70 years old still pertains to the educational crises of our time. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Support the channel. I appreciate it. Hope to see you soon.